There we go. So today is Unit 3, Part 2. As you can see, you don't see the title slide. um, so here's the agenda for today. Um, we've got a lot to cover. Well, I'm going to try to condense some of these as much as I can. I will cover some important things in greater detail. And you can tell, hopefully, whether or not something's going to be absolutely important or not. Okay. I'm going to give it a few minutes until we start. I will hold office. I will make this note. I will be holding office hours at 5. No, not 5. At 6 is when I'm holding them. So if you do have any questions, you had to leave early, but you can make it to those office hours, PST by the way, feel free to do so. Since I did start the event like 5 minutes early, we'll probably start at 3 something, I don't know, like 33 maybe, or maybe at 3:30 sharp. We'll see. I also will want to make this note. I've been pretty detailed for the past review sessions. Here's the thing is I have a relatively good memory. You don't need to memorize everything I'm giving to you guys. All you need to know is the historical development, and we will go over the CED to point out some important stuff. Some of this will involve the optional documents they put on there, just because I think it's worthy to note such documents and such evidence. Because who doesn't like extra leeway with EBD or just evidence in general for the LEQ? All right, well, it's 3:30. Oh, wait, hold on. I do need to mention, here's this feedback. I do need to go back to about us. So yes, this is from Hive 5 Hive. Hopefully you know 5 Hive already, because we've been doing a lot of stuff, and I've been doing a lot of stuff particularly. So hopefully you've heard of 5 Hive. Hopefully some of you are interested in joining 5 Hive to help out. So here's this information will be in the slides. There's the lecture feedback. Again, complimentary disclaimer. We're not endorsed by College Board because College Board likes to stay secret. We are a volunteering organization. And here are some expectations. Just be respectful. And, just treat this as you would as a chill class, right? Okay, so now we can move on with information. So here's the agenda. We've got a lot of topics, 7 of them. I will try to keep them as brief as possible, but I can't make any promises for one of them, COF 3.10, because that is a pretty heavy topic. According to the CED, there's a lot of developments that College Board wants you to know, so we will be a little thorough with that. But with the rest, we can glance over like the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, since most of it is like popular history. But I will leave up some questions for you guys once I go over the basics. All right. So let's get started with 3.6 very quickly. So shortly after the revolution, we get quite a bit of important developments in regards to global history, as well as history inside the U.S. So let's start with the history inside the U.S. After the American Revolution, you're going to see some social and political movements. Plural implies there's multiple, but really the biggest one that you have to know for sure is abolitionism. And the reason why abolitionism starts to grow is a variety of things. First of all, there is a proclamation that I neglected to mention in the previous lecture regarding the American Revolution, and that is Dunmore's Proclamation of 1775. Basically, the premise of that proclamation was, hey, slaves, join the British. If you fight and we win, you are going to be free. And the Americans will adopt a similar position. So some colonists are going to interact with some black soldiers. And we actually do have entire regiments of black soldiers. For example, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, you don't need to know that for sure. But you do need to know that there will be movements for emancipation as well as expanding natural rights to African Americans. And evidence of that, if you want to look into it, the Act for Gradual Abolition in 1780 is going to be a piece of legislation that will detail how are we going to release the slaves in the North, for the most part. You're also going to see freedom petitions in Massachusetts. Basically, these are real petitions that will demand the freedom of slaves and to grant them natural rights. So just know that abolitionism starts to kick up in this time, although it's not going to reach the sheer magnitude until the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century. We're going to see a lot of, a buildup of support for that. Another kind of movement, some people call it a movement, some people call it a concept, it's both really, is the idea of the Republican motherhood. Now, what is the Republican motherhood? It's the idea that women should have expanded roles in the American political culture. And how would they participate in such culture? Well, they would teach Republican values while they were raising their children, right? So this is not necessarily a form of feminism, per se, right? Feminism, we officially see feminism after Seneca Falls, right? With Susan B. Anthony and all those important figures, which we will discuss in greater depth when we talk about suffrage. But this is rather a form of a redefinition of kind of the role of the woman in the household. So instead of just being there for cooking or whatever, the cult of domesticity type of thing, they're also going to be indirectly involved in this kind of political climate. Again, at this point, women can't vote. Only men could vote. And not even all men could vote at this time. Just make sure that even though they had a redefined role in the American political culture, doesn't mean they could directly participate in it. Examples of people who would represent, again, the Daughters of Liberty. I picked out the same picture I used. But also Abigail Adams is another figure influential in the Republican motherhood. Basically, her primary argument is, remember the ladies who made clothes for you guys. So yeah, again, the detail with Abigail Adams and the Daughters of Liberty is not paramount, but you should know that the concept of Republican motherhood kind of arises out of the American Revolution as well. Now, after the American Revolution, we see 3 more important revolutions in global history. First one is going to be France, and we will actually go back to the French Revolution. The French Revolution is going to kick off. You don't need to know the entire story behind that because that's French history. But you do need to know that the French had their own revolution, kicked out the monarchy, had this entire period of instability in Europe, and we will talk about the instability in Europe later on when we discuss 3.10, because that will lead to foreign policy discussion. Other revolutions you should know, the Haitian Revolution, which was a pretty important one in as far as global history goes. Again, you don't need to know how it kicked out or the entire thing. Another revolution you should know about is the Latin American Revolution that involves Simón Bolívar. Again, same principle. The fact that the American Revolution succeeded and that there were these kind of democratic principles being asserted in the world kind of gave these people the idea that, hey, maybe we should do the same thing. Any question about 3.6? What time range we are in? Around 1776. Really, the exact dates are 1754 to 1800. 1800 is going to be our cutoff date. So the turn of the 19th century. The reason why we cut off at 1800 is Thomas Jefferson. That's about it. Any big questions on 3.6, or am I good to go on? I'm seeing no questions in the chat, so let's go on to the Articles of Confederation. So, hopefully you guys know that the Articles of Confederation is actually our kind of first form of legitimate government, not the Constitution. And if you don't remember that, now's the time to remember it. Because it sometimes gets featured, sometimes it doesn't, but it is something worth knowing. So, throughout the American Revolution, we will see the establishment of state constitutions, one such as Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, etc. All the 13 colonies will adopt their own constitution. The key principle about these state constitutions, though, is that they will delegate power to principally legislative bodies. So what do legislative bodies do? Something like a Congress, right? Our modern day Congress is a legislative body that is bicameral. And what they will do is, they draft up legislation, laws, and stuff like that. So all the power is going to go to those types of institutions or entities, political entities. What the Articles of Confederation is going to be modeled off is going to be exactly those state constitutions. And do keep in mind, the Articles of Confederation was being set up during the American Revolution. As, all this funny is going on, we decide, hey, we need some kind of thing, some kind of thing to order, some kind of order to all this. And that being, a national kind of government. Now, the main principles of the Articles of Confederation, which I shortened to AOC in here, not to be confused with the current representative, is there should be a national government, and it's going to be a legislative government, effectively a Congress, but it's going to be limited. They're going to severely, and I mean severely, limit the powers of the national government by a whole lot. At this point, it's not going to be able to do a whole lot of stuff. And here's what I'm going to list off: some powers of the national government. They can coin money, they can direct the post office, and they can direct foreign negotiation with foreign powers such as Britain or France or even tribal nations, native nations, I should say. But aside from that, either they would need a pure what's it called? They need pure agreement, right? Everyone needs to give absolute consent. What is it called? Overwhelming majority or whatever. They need an overwhelming majority, like 12 out of 13 states, to agree to anything they do as a national government. Probably the worst limit that they had. My God, I am not thinking. Probably the worst limit that they endowed upon this national government was they had to request money and soldiers from the states, and they could not do any taxes. Now, right now, you might think, under this current constitution, which is the first constitution, the only constitution we've had so far, well, kind of. Articles of Confederation might be considered a constitution in its own right. You might be thinking, oh, this kind of form of government sucks. The national government isn't really effective. Yeah, but you need to understand that the Founding Fathers are coming out of the idea that no taxation without representation is the key idea here. So they were really terrified of a powerful national government kind of superseding the whole thing they were fighting for. Obviously, it's overkill. The reason why I bring up specifically the requesting money from the states and the no taxes part is, well, if the government can't raise taxes, they have to raise money from somewhere, and it's from the states. As you can imagine, states be states, and they don't really care. They're not going to really fulfill their own part with providing money to the national government. And so we're going to have a pretty dirt poor economy. We're going to have a government that can't pay off debts. We're going to have people who are not going to have, who are owed money, for example, veterans from the American Revolution, and they're not going to have those, they're not going to be paid. They're not going to be paid pensions at all. And this part, not being paid pensions, are actually going to lead to a certain rebellion. That's going to be Shays' Rebellion. Now, did Shays' Rebellion succeed? No, absolutely not. I mean, this illustration will show you. They did not succeed. But the key idea with Shays' Rebellion that brought up concerns was that this was part of the fault that the national government was weak. So we need to avoid this. Otherwise, we're going to see more uprisings. And at one point, an uprising might actually be strong enough to topple a government, whether it be a state government or the national government. Remember that the national government can't call its own army. That's the whole thing with the tyranny that the Americans didn't want to have. So what Shays' Rebellion is gonna lead to is the call for, hey, we gotta redraft this stuff. It needs like a full remake. We need a better government. Now, initially, the Constitutional Convention, which is what this convention is gonna be, wasn't intended to redraft this entire thing, but really what happens is that, yeah, we gotta tear it all down and make our own constitution. And we will get to the Constitutional Convention and all the Constitution stuff later. But I do want to mention one thing that the Articles of Confederation managed to pass, and that is the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787. This is actually the only success that the Articles of Confederation has, aside from existing for a little bit. Basically, the Northwest Ordinance was dealing with the Northwest Territory, basically where the Ohio area, that Midwest area is. It gave kind of a step-by-step basis of how we could admit states. It also abolished, prohibited slavery in that area, the Northwest Territory, and it did dictate some kind of process with dealing with natives, as in, we want to maintain a good relationship with the Native Americans, but Americans be Americans, they will ignore that, and they will encroach on native land, and we will talk about that later in a little bit more detail. Unanimous. Yes. Unanimous. Thank you. I don't know why my brain blanked on that. Yes, it had to be near unanimous. So yeah. Any questions about the Articles of Confederation? That was a little quick. So just to reiterate, very limited government, rebellion, Shays' Rebellion. We need a stronger government. What event led up to Shays' Rebellion? So, it's more so of a development. Basically, the national government cannot raise money itself. It cannot tax. So what it had to do under the Articles of Confederation was to request money from the states. It can't force the states to give them stuff, so you can imagine how that goes. So, yeah. Now, the national government can't pay stuff. States are not giving it a lot of money. Then you got a poor economy going on there. All the states are doing their own stuff. They have their own money, by the way. I want to make that clear. They have their own money, so it's not organized. And this will kind of build up resentment among farmers who were veterans of the American Revolution, who haven't had their pensions paid for a long, long time. And so eventually we're going to see the rebellion we'll call Shays' Rebellion, led by Daniel Shays. By the way, kind of ending to Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays did not get executed, but he ended up getting his pension paid in 5 years after the rebellion ended. So I guess the Constitution worked in some ways, because that's after the Constitution was established. Question: the Massachusetts Constitution still works? Yes, it is still in operation. If you go up to the Constitution of Massachusetts, it's the current Constitution. I'm not sure. I don't know anything about Massachusetts history, even though I have family who live there. Nor do I really care much for Massachusetts history. I'm supposing that they're able to make amendments to that. Another thing to note about the Massachusetts Constitution is that compared to the other constitutions, such as Virginia, Massachusetts was relatively, how should I put this, more tolerant, so to speak. There were a few state constitutions that actually dictated kind of certain rights to women, as well dictating kind of the emancipation part for African Americans. I'm not sure if Massachusetts is one of those. I could read through the whole document, but that's just not worth it. Don't read through any state constitutions, even though they're on the APUSH CED. Okay, with that said, we will have an MCQ, just to make sure you guys remember what I just said about the Shays Rebellion. So I'm going to give you guys 1 to 2 minutes to read through the question and give your response. I think 1 to 2 questions is fair, because 55 minutes for 55 questions is important. If you want to, you can spoiler mark your answer. That would be nice for people who are still reading through. So I'll come back at 3:50. You use these bars on both sides, so use these straight bars, 2 on each side of your text. Exactly what Nicholas put in. No, not absolute value bars. Yeah, use 2 bars on each side. There we go. I was relatively quick. Does anyone else need more time? It's okay, because that was less than, that was less than 1 minute. So, I'm waiting for people to type out their thoughts. How do you send a hidden message? What Nicholas put, spoiler text. Well, unfortunately, time's up, so if you don't know how to spoil, just put in your answer now. I'm going to look through all of your answers. The majority of you are saying B, which is correct. Does anyone want explanation behind that, or is it simple enough? I'm seeing no questions about this, so I think everyone got the idea that Shays Rebellion highlighted flaws in the Articles of Confederation, which was kind of the exigence for the Constitutional Convention. So that's going to segue us into the probably easiest topics, 3.8 and 3.9. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, unless anyone objects to that and wants me to go through it a bit more thoroughly. I'm leaving this option to you guys, actually. Are we feeling for a detailed yap session, or what you really need to know, and that will be enough? I'm fine with it being quick. Okay. Sorry everyone who thought otherwise, but it is a pretty not important. So, Constitutional Convention. Ultimately, out of this, we obviously get the Constitution ratified. But the process for getting the Constitution ratified was tricky. Because you had multiple parties, and trying to get a group of people to agree on one thing is just absolutely horrible, and it's a nightmare. Um, so what they're gonna do is they're gonna compromise. Because what's the best way to get everyone happy? Make everyone not exactly happy, but satisfied. I think that works. That's the intended system with our current government as well, or current structured government, is compromise, compromise, compromise. And the founding fathers will actually, hey, compromise is an important thing for Congress. So there are two compromises that go off the top of my head that are very important. One of them is much, much more important than the other. First one's going to be the Great Compromise. So the Great Compromise will involve Congress. Initially, they wanted a unicameral Congress, that is, to be one chamber. But there were two plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Why did I almost go into, never mind. So the Virginia plan was the idea that the Congress should be represented on the basis of population. And some people think, yeah, this makes sense, right? Unless you were a small state. If you did not have a huge population, you would effectively have less power than a state like New York or Virginia or Massachusetts. Is Massachusetts huge? I guess it's relatively huge. Not as huge as Virginia at the time or New York. The small states are going to propose the New Jersey plan. Basically, the idea that representation is on the basis that everyone gets the same amount of representatives. And this is favored by small states. Obviously, the big states don't like that because, well, that means people living in the big states are worth less than the people who are living in the small states. Kind of agree with them on that. But that doesn't matter. But this conflict, that's not good. You're immediately arguing over the legislative body, which was, the one body that the Articles of Confederation is under. And you'll know that the Constitution establishes 3 branches, 3 bodies. And if they're arguing over the legislative body, then this is not productive. So what they're going to do is they're going to compromise. Hey, why not do both? ¿Por qué no los dos? So they're going to adopt a bicameral Congress. It's going to be the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives is, for the most part, population-based. There's actually a cap on it. We passed a piece of legislation that limits the amount of representatives because you can only fit so much people in the chamber. But I think they adjusted the calculation for the representation. I hope they did, at least. As for the Senate, it's equal. 2 senators per state. That's our modern system with a Senate. The other compromise is going to involve the slave states and the states that started abolitionism, like Massachusetts or New York. Not exactly New York, but this conflict is going to be about the slaves. Now, in fact, this compromise doesn't involve freeing slaves. It's about counting slaves, right? If we're going to count population into our legislative representation, then how do we count slaves? We consider them as property, which is kind of messed up. But again, this is going to lead to a whole debate on, okay, how should we treat slaves? Southern states are actually going to say, hey, let's treat them as people. Each slave counts as one. It's going to work to their advantage because higher population. But the other states think, nah, man, this is kind of... this is sus, bro. Like, this is not something you call them property, and now you're considering them as part of your population? Like, what the hell, dude? Eventually what happens is the 3/5 compromise. Basically, you count up all the slaves, take 3/5 of that, and that's your population. Don't ask why a part of a person will count into your representation. I don't know, man. They don't do math over there. Another thing you should consider is the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate over the federal government. I don't know why I made those 2 bullet points. Basically, the idea, the key point between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is the idea of the power of government. And that debate's going to now transfer over to the idea of the Bill of Rights and enumerated powers. Now, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists will agree, okay, this government should not be tyrannical. State government should have some degree of power. That's the idea of federalism. But whether or not the Constitution was enough to pass, well, that's the key thing. Federalists believe, it's enough. We've given it the kind of structure that is strong enough, but it's not going to be tyrannical. Anti-Federalists will disagree. It's like, hey, we need a Bill of Rights. Eventually, and anti-federalists will say we don't have the Bill of Rights. We shouldn't pass this. We're not going to ratify this. Well, the Constitution is going to get ratified, so in some ways the Federalists won, but the reason why they did is that, well, they passed the Bill of Rights after they ratified the Constitution. So in some ways, both parties are happy. Another example of a Constitution. Now, the Bill of Rights are going to be 10 amendments to the Constitutions that will dictate your rights. Right? The First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, petition, assembly, whatever. You don't need to know all of those amendments because this is an AP Gov. But just know, Bill of Rights was kind of an actual explicit mention of your natural rights. Obviously, we're going to see more amendments later on down the road in history. And they will be about rights. They will also be about the way the U.S. government works as well. Because you can't change anything the way the U.S. government works when you have a set constitution. Before I ask for any questions, let's move on quickly just to what 3.9 is all about, the Constitution. Constitution was basically only for the national government in terms of enumerated powers. No, that's wrong. Sorry. The Constitution will focus on the national government. There we go. It will mention key ideas such as federalism. Basically, okay, the national government will have enumerated powers. They may have concurrent powers with state governments, but the rest of that's for the states, such as education, technically driving laws, but the federal government did some wonky stuff to make driving laws uniform throughout the country. I won't mention that. The key idea of separation of powers, right? We got three bodies, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. I don't think I need to talk about what the branches do, but in case you don't know, legislative, they make legislation. Simple enough. They make laws. They do budget bills sometimes. That's Congress. Number 2 is going to be the executive branch. What they do, they execute the law, and that doesn't mean they're putting the law under a guillotine. That's stupid. What they do is they make sure the law is obeyed. And, the president is given the power to veto or sign a bill into law. But again, gov stuff. Third is going to be the judicial branch. Now, at the time of signing of the Constitution, the judicial branch is actually not going to be entirely, let's say, mature. It's not going to be exactly formal in some ways. It's just there. It exists. It's included, but no one really knows what it does, per se. It's not concrete. So that's why I'm going to mention our boy John Marshall, who is the longest serving Chief Justice in history. He's basically going to make a decision in Marbury v. Madison, which is going to give the judicial branch a key power, and that's judicial review. So that's what the judicial branches do. They govern cases, and in the case of the Supreme Court, they're actually going to look at things and decide whether or not they are constitutional. So now you see the balance of power, balance between all three branches. Now you can ask any questions about the Constitution. I might be omitting it quite a bit. Any questions about the Constitution or the Constitutional Convention, ratification, all that? I'm saying no questions, which means all of you guys did your basic civics, or you guys know popular history, because I think this stuff was also taught in middle school or something like that. So let's continue on to analysis, actually. So this is about the Constitutional Convention. It's Washington's letter to the President of Congress from the Articles of Confederation, mind you. This is an optional document, but I want you guys to take a look at it. This is a little bit of a shorter analysis because we want to make sure that we get through the stuff. So I'm going to give you guys maybe 5 to 8 minutes. Is that fair enough? Let's go with the minimum is 5 minutes and 8 minutes is the maximum. So we'll regroup. I'll check in at 4:07 and then you guys should be officially done by 4:10. Feel free to ask me any questions. I kind of, some of this might be unclear. Understand that the way they spell stuff is actually different in the time. So you might see some funny misspellings like federal, which will be spelled as federal, which is the most hilarious one to me. They'll also misspell increase as increased, um, somewhere in there. So if you need any clarification with that, feel free to ask me in the chat. Any questions? This might have scared some people. Any questions about the prompts? Or is it pretty straightforward for all of you? See, someone has started posting their response. Okay, that is distracting. Hold on. No, that's fair. We have 2 minutes left. Um, so hopefully you are almost done with your responses. If you want to make them detailed, you don't have to. Um, but do remember that the cutoff is going to be at 4:10. I'm going to start reading through responses at 4:10. So keep that in mind. As for the people who are watching the recording, here's the. There we go. Okay. Recordings will be on the lecture calendar. So go to announcements and look for Lance's announcement. Be linked to lecture calendar. I post my lectures and also all the slides. Oh my god, it's really dry today. It's 4:09. You got 1 minute, a little less than 1 minute left to finish out your response. If you are typing them in a doc, maybe start getting ready to port them over to the chat. It'd be really helpful to have as many responses as possible so I get an idea of whether or not you guys understand the content. Okay, it is 4:10. I guess we're going to start off with reading Emin's response, and we'll see if more people are going to type out their responses. So, 1 wanted to present the Constitution, explain the need for it. Pretty good summary. I mean, he gives his reasons for sending a letter. 2, the U.S. needed a stronger central government. Also, I guess the urgency and to preserve the Union. Yeah, the U.S. needs a stronger central government. The urgency will come from the fact that there, at any point, this kind of current system of government we have, that being the Articles of Confederation, it could actually be disastrous. And we're speaking with respect to Shays' Rebellion. So yeah, good response. We need a stronger central government. 3, to evaluate support for the Constitution and the Federalist cause. You could also talk about key points that Federalists will bring up, because he does give some details. Obviously not as much as the Federalist Papers, which is the series of articles that the Federalists will write in newspapers to persuade the general American public to support the Constitution. You don't think you've done stuff like this, like the analysis or the content? This is not an SAQ. This is just for you to write out your thoughts. SAQ is going to be at the end of the lecture if we have time. It looks like we do. So you don't need to do all the T stuff. That's alright. It's just all you need to do is just respond to the questions, give your own thoughts, and that's it. It's not like I'm grading it as if it's an SAQ. I'm reading through whether or not you guys understand everything. Well, I don't see any other responses, so I'm not sure if is this very boring for you guys, so you guys don't want to do it? Because it's understandable. It's just I need to understand whether or not you guys get the whole idea that we got the Constitution for a stronger central government compared to that we had compared to the Articles of Confederation. Oh, is is does everyone happen to be eating right now while I'm doing this lecture? I mean, it is 4:13. It's I am hungry now. It is 4:13. Kind of baking while watching, doing homework. Oh yeah, it is dinner over there. Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay. I guess I have to take Emin as your representative. Thing is, you're not great at understanding text. Well, the thing is with A push is that you part of the thing with doing history is being able to read text and interpret political cartoons. That's the whole thing with the DBQs, right? And also understanding graphs that will illustrate historical developments. Um, that might have been a little quick. 8 minutes. Do you for those of you who don't understand this part of the lecture, would it be beneficial for me to move on and to let you guys read through the text yourselves? It is a pretty long text and it is archaic English, archaic syntax and diction and spelling and all that. So the text I provided, which is Washington's letter to the President of Congress, I probably should have put instructions to make this clear. You're reading the text I just provided in Analysis 1, and you are going to respond to A, B, and C. That's how these analysis slides work. Does that make sense? And yes, it's a good point that compromise was needed to ratify the Constitution. That's okay. For anyone else, do you want to move on quickly from this text? Because there is a second analysis section, and we could be more in depth with that if you want to. How are we feeling with that? Moving on and covering more of the review, and then doing another practice analysis. Feel good about that? Okay. So let's move on to, we just did 3.9, so let's move on to the, oh my god. Let's move on to 3.10. Okay, I'm not particularly excited about 3.10, and the reason why I'm not excited about it is because there's a lot of stuff to know. It is the long one, yeah. Lots of developments, CED. So I might miss some parts, and if I do, the CED will remind me when I go through the in summary part, and then I will give you a bit of detail in that if needed. So let's start. The way I'm dividing this up is going to be the Washington administration, then the Adams administration, and we'll talk a little bit of more foreign diplomacy in more detail, which is explicitly mentioned in the CED. So let's start with Washington's administration. If you want to know your dates, Washington's administration started in 1789 and ended in 1796. Not that you really need to know that, but if you want to, there you go. It's easy to do the math. Just go 4 years before 1800. That's the end of Washington's term. Second term. So, first thing I want to talk about regarding Washington's administration, aside from the fact that he stepped down after 2 terms and gave the title of office the president, like a president of a club, those are not entirely too relevant, except for the 2-term part. I want to talk about the National Bank first. So, the National Bank debate was a pretty huge debate between primarily Hamilton and Jefferson, both of which who were members of Washington's cabinet. Oh, another precedent he established, the cabinet. Initially, there were four secretaries: Secretary of State, Secretary of War, which is now the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, and I'm blanking on the last one. Attorney General, which is the Secretary of Justice. It's now called the Attorney General today. Anyways, side tangent. Hamilton v. Jefferson. Hamilton was someone who supported the national bank. It was pretty much his idea, and his reasoning behind it is, well, we got a national government and we've got an economy. Let's make sure the economy isn't going to die, and that's one thing the national bank would do. Jefferson will propose the idea that, hey, that's not in the Constitution, and you can't make this stuff up. You shouldn't be doing this. And this is going to go back to two different kinds of interpretations about the Constitution. Strict versus loose interpretation. So in this case, we are going to look at the national bank, whether or not we should have a loose interpretation. That is to say that, hey, it is implied that maybe the national government should establish a national bank per the necessary and proper clause. Basically, the necessary and proper clause is that, hey, we got the power to do stuff, to do whatever you want in order to make sure that you are going to fulfill your duties. That's the necessary and proper clause. Pretty self-explanatory from the title. Some people call it the elastic clause. Basically, there's some elasticity with what the government can do in order to make sure that its job is done. National bank, the strict interpretation is, okay, the national bank is not directly mentioned. We shouldn't do this. Eventually, Washington's going to favor Hamilton, and the national bank is the first American national bank is going to be established. So the first BUS, because the acronym is Bank of the United States, is going to be established under Washington's term. This is going to put in one constitutional principle into question, that being the necessary and proper clause. The next one is going to involve the Whiskey Rebellion, and for some reason I decided to move on to the Proclamation of Neutrality. So we'll just talk about the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is going to lead to the whole Napoleonic Wars thing going on in Europe. No one cares about that. That's not in America. But the Americans will care because a variety of things are going to happen. And we're not going to talk about those variety of things until we talk until much later. We will talk about, the effects of the French Revolution and the war in Europe on American foreign policy. But what George Washington is going to follow is the idea of isolationism. The Proclamation of Neutrality is going to say, hey, we're not going to get up in Europe's business. You guys chill out, and we will chill out. Obviously, that's not going to entirely happen with the French and British. But the actual important thing I do want to talk about is the Whiskey Rebellion. Proclamation of Neutrality, not so much, but the Whiskey Rebellion, which breaks out in 1791, is going to be another test of constitutional power given to the national government. Context for the Whiskey Rebellion, by the way, is a bunch of farmers who don't benefit from a whiskey tax, in air quotes, because it's not necessarily a whiskey tax, are going to rise up and they're going to assault a bunch of tax collectors. And they'll formally have their own kind of uprising. Washington's response to it is going to be nationalizing or federalizing the local militia, wherever the Whiskey Rebellion was, I think Massachusetts. And he's going to use those nationalized militias or federalized militias to put down the rebellion, which was relatively peaceful, kind of. Basically, this demonstration of power was to show that, okay, the national government could intervene during times of political unrest. So the Whiskey Rebellion is different from the Shays Rebellion in that it was effectively put down. It was also a demonstration of effective national power. So that's all you need to know about the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, Washington's farewell address. Do you need to know all of it? Well, Washington's farewell address is important for two things. He's going to tell Americans not to form political parties because they do cause division and they make factionalism worse in Congress. So true, by the way. It's this problem we're experiencing now. And also, let's try to stay isolationist. We shouldn't be in any kind of foreign alliances, especially if they are permanent. Obviously, if you know American history, we're not going to follow his advice. But it is something worth mentioning, because, again, the build up to throughout American history is going to go back to this point in time, his farewell address, and say, yeah, there's going to be quite a bit of division throughout U.S. history. That's the key point of the farewell address. We hope for not much division, and then here we are. We get our first political party system. So I'm not going to ask questions about Washington or Adams until I get to the end of 3.10. So about the Adams term, John Adams, not John Quincy Adams, both very different people. His administration is 1797 to 1801. He only served one term. During his administration, we see the rise of political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Adams himself was a Federalist. Federalists, you should know the difference between Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Democratic Republicans was mainly led by Thomas Jefferson. James Madison is also going to be part of that party as well. Basically, one key idea is strict versus loose interpretation, but also French Revolution. And also the powers of the national government. Federalists will believe that, hey, the national government should be powerful. Democratic Republicans will believe maybe state governments should have some kind of sovereignty, guys. So yeah, that's the particular difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, where the political power should lie. Now, a key event during Adams' tenure as president is the Quasi-War, basically a period of undeclared war between the French and Americans. So yeah, at some point we were fighting the French. Not officially, though. Congress did not declare war. Basically, the whole foreign policy involved is that, well, American ships want to do their stuff with Britain. Because, hey, Britain might be a valuable trading power because they speak the same English. But the French are going to think, nah, that's not cool because, Britain's at war with France. So they're going to interfere with that, and that's going to lead to a series of naval conflicts. And I put in an illustration, the USS Constitution, aptly named, battling the insurgent, also aptly named. But before that, we also see the XYZ affair. Basically, 3 French diplomats are going to go on over, and they're going to cause a lot of havoc in that saying, hey, we're going to be strong with this kind of thing. You need to stop trading with the British. And also pay us stuff. Because we're not going to have diplomatic negotiations until you pay us stuff. So again, extorting Americans to some extent. So this is going to lead to pro-British sentiment. And then it's going to be pro-French sentiment when Thomas Jefferson gets into office. But that's besides the point. But throughout this quasi-war, we're going to see some criticisms from the Democratic Republicans regarding Adams and the way he kind of addresses this kind of conflict. So Adams' response is to clearly break the, to violate rights and, pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. We'll sign it into law. The Federalists are going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Adams will sign it into law in 1798. You don't need to know the exact statutes of the Alien and Sedition Acts, but basically, if you criticize Adams, he's going to be a crybaby and suppress your free speech. That's not cool. It will get repealed, by the way. The Democratic Republicans' response to that will be the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which was officially passed in 1799, but it was drafted immediately in response. And the key ideas with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was the affirming the states' rights, and this will actually lead to the nullification crisis regarding John C. Calhoun, regarding the states' rights and whether or not they could nullify a law. Okay, now the last thing that happens during technically not during Adams' presidency, but it does involve Adams' presidency, is the midnight appointments. Adams is going to lose the election of 1800, and he knows that his good old friend, pretty much bitter enemies at this point in time, but they will become friends later on when they die. And Jefferson's going to come in, and what Adams is going to do is he's going to appoint a lot of people right before Jefferson walks in. When Jefferson walks in, his Secretary of State, Madison, is going to reject Marbury, his position in the federal government. Marbury's going to sue Madison. You're going to get the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison, which John Marshall presides over as the Chief Justice. And what he's going to do is say, you know what, Madison, just do it. But that's not actually the most important part. The key important part in his opinion is actually going to be judicial review. And I already mentioned this about judicial review regarding the Constitution, but it's not, again, let me reiterate this. It's not in the Constitution, but Marbury v. Madison is going to establish the idea of judicial review, that being the Supreme Court can review anything, such as legislation or executive orders, etc., and determine whether or not it's constitutional. If it's unconstitutional, it is nullified. Now, there is a kind of a loophole with it in that technically you can overturn Marbury v. Madison and overturn the Supreme Court's sole important power, but that rests on the Supreme Court. And any Supreme Court that gives up its own power is kind of nuts. But that's all you really need to know about Adams' presidency. Okay, last slide. I promise this is the last slide. And this is going to be more about foreign policy, Spain and American Indians. Again, things College Board wants you to know. Oh my god. Okay. So, diplomacy with Europe. What we're going to do in 1794, so that's within Washington's tenure, is we're going to negotiate a treaty with the British. Sorry, that's a bit vulgar. And that's going to be negotiated by Jay, and we're going to call it Jay's Treaty. This is going to be a pro-British treaty. All you need to know is that it benefits the British in terms of trade and all that over the French. And the French Revolution and, the XYZ affair is going to be in response to that Jay's Treaty. They're not going to be happy about their trade with Britain. And then there's all that quasi-war I mentioned. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, another form of diplomacy that the Americans will engage with the Europeans is going to be Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. The reason why we have Pinckney's Treaty is, well, Americans want to go west. They're running out of land. And that's kind of a consistent thing they've been doing since Unit 2. Here's the thing. Spain controls Louisiana and Florida, and they're expanding into that without any okay signs from the Spanish. So the Spanish are going to feel a bit angry, one way to put it. So one way they do this is, okay, they're going to negotiate a treaty regarding how Americans are going to settle in the West. Now, eventually, Spain is actually going to give back Louisiana to the French, and the French are going to sell it to the Americans, but that's in Unit 4. By the way, a few things you need to know that not only did we engage in actual naval conflicts with the British and French over merchant ships, we actually catered to both, by the way, in terms of trade. We also had naval impressment. Basically, they would force American sailors to serve in their navy. So yeah, that's one key thing that they also did. As for Spanish activity, aside from, having Louisiana, they didn't really do much with it. They're actually going to expand into California. They're going to build missions in California. And what these missions are going to do is the same stuff they've been doing over and over since Unit 1. Which is to say, abuse Native Americans on a whole lot of levels. But the reason why I want to mention missions being expanded to California and actually in the current modern-day U.S. territories is that this is going to lead to some unique cultures as well. But that's all College Board wants you to know. They didn't really go into much detail, unfortunately. But do know that the expansion into California and all that will set up kind of a road to the Mexican-American War. If you don't remember, Mexico will exist. They will break free from Spain, and they will have California and Texas. And all that is something Americans will want, and that will lead to the Mexican-American War. Even then, College Board doesn't highlight the key importance between this, and that's why I don't like them about that. Okay, last bullet point. Indians. You need to know the relationship of American Indian. Well, you don't need to know. It's not going to be on College Board on the exam a whole lot. But what College Board suggests you to know is that you should know the relationship between Native Americans and the American government. One optional document that I think is a little bit interesting is from the Oneida Nation, basically a Native American tribe somewhere in the Midwest. The Oneida Nation actually participated in the American Revolution on our side, and the letter from the Oneida Nation is basically asking George Washington, "Hey, can you guys pay our pensions? We served in the, we had officers, working with yours, please." And Washington's going to actually agree to that. So that's one good thing Americans have done for Native Americans, in this point of time. Another thing is that the American government will consider Native Americans as sovereign nations. So they're going to actually negotiate treaties, which is a bit of a delicate balance in terms of how things work with Native Americans. Again, the whole reservation system is actually a pretty complicated thing. But they're going to negotiate treaties mainly to not placate, but to promise the natives that they will, preserve their autonomy. Again, Americans are going to ignore that. They're going to encroach on their lands. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in, I guess, 3.12? Yes, in 3.12. Another thing you should also know is that Native Americans will have no citizenship in the official American government. Under the American government. So basically, in summary, Native Americans were independent, quote unquote, from the American government. That's the key thing. Okay, that's the end of 3.10. Are there any questions? Because I feel like there are going to be questions on this. Washington was ahead of his time. In some ways he was. It's a lot. Someone is typing out their thoughts, so I'm going to let it finish. For those of you who are new, 3.10 is about Washington, Adams, and kind of the foreign stuff in Europe, as well as Native Americans. It's a long CED, but to be honest, some developments are useless for the exam. Don't tell College Board I said that. Is it even relevant to learn about Pinckney's treaty? To be frankly honest, no. you can get along just fine without it. The only instance where it might prove useful if you had a really specific SAQ regarding things that the Americans did with other countries. But in that case, you could just talk about France and Britain. So it's as simple as that, really. So yeah. I know I'm giving you guys a lot of details, but you don't need to absolutely remember everything. We're going to go over the CED and point out some key details that you should know, if we have time. Is that the only question about 3.10? By the way, asking questions about whether or not some things are absolutely important for the exam are good questions. Because I don't want to encourage people to memorize events and then not be able to use them. I'm seeing no one type in the chat, so... Okay. Let's move on to the actually lightest topics. In fact, they might not actually be... They might not even appear on the exam. Actually, no. Yeah, no, we're going to move on to analysis. There we go. So, I talked about Washington's farewell address. We're going to read through it. So this is a little bit of a longer analysis. So I encourage you guys to work on this. The last part D, is about constructing an argument. This is probably going to be the first time I start doing this. I would encourage you guys to do that one in a little bit more detail. So as such, I might be giving you guys 10 minutes eh, 8 minutes at least, and then we'll see. But after 10 minutes, see if that's gonna be enough time for people to write out stuff. Does that sound good? So 8 to 10 minutes to type out your responses. Okay. As always, if you have any questions about the stimulus or any of the prompts, ask me, okay? As for our good old friends watching the recording, I'm going to leave this on for a little bit. Feel free to pause the recording as well so that you can do it. I see Emin is... Again, as always with these questions, it's the best way for me to make sure to assess whether or not you guys understand the content clearly. Um, Oh, I should probably clarify this. The difference between C and D is explaining how someone can use it for any kind of argument. But part D is for you to make your own argument on, and you need to give your own like explanation of the source in respect to that argument. So this is a little bit of practicing with the DBQ. Just to want to make sure I clarify that, because that might not be entirely too clear from reading. So I will have to rewrite that a little bit. So it's been around 8 minutes. How are we looking on time? Just realized it was 8 minutes. So I'm getting no response about the time, but you guys do have like a few minutes left. I do get that some of you guys are eating. So, um, we're gonna wait for responses. Hopefully, we'll get some by 4:45. Because I do not want to go over time regarding walking through the CED. That is a pretty important thing to do. It's okay, you can edit your response. Um, okay. So, does anyone need time to edit their response or add more details to their response? I know Emin is probably editing. So, let's start with someone else's response. So, A. He's advising America on political matters of the future since he's not going to be president anymore. So yeah, the key thing about Washington's farewell address is to ensure that Americans will follow certain principles to make sure that there is some kind of national unity. Um, National unity is a part of Washington's concerns because that's what political parties might do. It might tear up national unity. The significance of kind of giving this advice is the idea that um sorry, I'm blanking on the term. The key idea, the significance of his address specifically is that um the idea of trying to remain away from political parties while having your own kind of bias in a Republican system is a little strange. But also at the same time, Washington's farewell address does set a precedent for the contact between a president or an American leader with the public. That's one key part. But yes, advising America on political matters is a good response. I like that. Sage advice for a young country as well. I saw from Emin's response as well. It's a good precedent to establish. Okay, part B. What does Washington caution Americans against? The source. Why? Political parties and political deals with Europeans, because Europeans are cringe. I'm kidding. He warns of America's internal danger of political parties and the external danger of permanent relations with foreign nations. There is a why question, but I think you too might understand why, right? We're going to move on to part C. Because I did talk about permanent relations with foreign nations kind of being a key issue, especially with the British and the French. 3, a historian may use this document to support the idea of little political opposition within the government, era of good feelings, similarity, interesting, or to state how Americans tend to favor neutrality and not much foreign involvement. So, I like the key idea with a little political opposition, right? Washington's administration was pretty good feelings like. The idea that Americans favored neutrality over no foreign involvement is a little because some Americans did favor involvement in the French Revolution, specifically the support of the French Revolution. Such Americans were like the Democratic Republicans. So that last part, not exactly the best response. See, they wanted to be more isolationist. It would be a good idea to explain the argument about American administrations and isolationism. See, not work on part D, which is okay. Question would be something to the extent, like evaluate the extent of American policy during the 1750 time period. Very weak thesis, but you get the gist of it. You'd use XYZ affair, impressment, and stuff like war to support government. Although the American people and the federal government called for involvement in foreign affairs, such as supporting the French in the French-British conflict, President Washington suggested that Americans should not involve themselves with foreign revolutions. And I would hope that you would use the source, key details in this source to support that, right? XYZ affair, impressment would be good EBD with that in a DBQ. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Any questions about analysis 2? Nope. All right. Let's move on to the lighter topics this time. They're very bare. So 3.11 is about American identity, because why not? The first bullet point, culture among American regions, is actually to mean to say that we developed a national culture, which is the same as national identity in the arts. Now, culture among American regions, someone living in the South is going to live a different lifestyle or have a different culture as someone living in New England. Hopefully that much is, frankly, obvious to you, right? The Southern and New England both developed economically very differently. New England was less reliant on slavery, and the South was really reliant on slavery. But that's not, the key gist of it. Basically, even though there are diverse American regions at this time, we will develop a sense of unity. And ways to do that is art. So let's talk about some arts. So, arts being literature, architecture, and actual art. So let's talk about the art. So this painting here is the Declaration of Independence by John Trumbull, and it was painted in 1818. I know this is outside of the period, but he was active within the period, so that counts, right? It's also a famous painting, and I felt like including it. So the key thing about art, at least when developing the American identity, not related to the Hudson River School, by the way, which is my favorite kind of American art, actually. Key idea with American art in this time period is a portrayal of American history and American principles. So, for example, Declaration of Independence, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and all that. All of these works are going to portray a very... Okay, in terms of slang, it's like they're glazing American history. That's really what they're doing with these paintings. Not particularly interesting, per se. But when we look at American literature, that might be a little bit more interesting. Trying to develop a literary identity separate, distinguished from British literature. And one of the ways they're going to actually do that is American Romanticism, and probably the most famous genre we're going to look at if you were to study American Romanticism would be American Gothic novels. So like Edgar Allan Poe, Night of Sleepy Hollow. General key ideas with American Romanticism will kind of establish some kind of story that would take place in America, but the way it's portrayed is not going to be distinctly American until much later in American history. So it's the one thing to know. And the last thing, which is my favorite because it's always a vibe to look at, is federal architecture. And I'm not talking about the architecture of the federal government. That's classical architecture. I'm talking about architecture that's kind of uniform throughout the colonies. So I included a picture of an example of federal architecture. This is from Kentucky, but if you go to Boston, you'll see a lot of federal architecture if you go to the historical sites. Anything that comes from historical districts in Boston will most likely be an example of federal architecture. Federal architecture is going to be somewhat similar to classical, except, well, it's not going to be full-on classical. It will use some certain techniques from classical architecture, such as the pillars, but it's kind of uniquely American. And that's probably the one thing, federal architecture, that would be very American in this point in time. Like, if you traveled anywhere else in the world at this point, you would not see something quite similar to federal architecture. It's always pretty to look at, too. Any questions on 3.11? It's short, by the way. You don't need to know too many details or examples or paintings and works of art. But do know that the Americans were in the process of crafting their own unique identity to distinguish themselves from the British. Which is kind of hilarious because some of these guys spoke with a British accent. But that's besides the point. I'm seeing no one's typing in the chat. Oh, never mind. A cup of tea in it. It's a bit cringe in it. Oi, bruv. Anyways. Someone is actually typing, so maybe it might be a question. Am I going to go over the large units for A push? I'm going over every unit. This is a pretty large unit, but I'm also going over the rest of the units. They'll all be split up into 2 parts each. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on this topic before we move on? I think you guys are done with art stuff. This is an art history. Okay. Well, we're going to finish off with 3.12, which is called Movement in the Early Republic. Basically, it's about migration, not actual social movements. We talked about influence of revolutionary ideals. That's the only social movements we'll talk about. Natives are going to respond to migrations to the west, with violence. So we're going to get, and the reason why they do this, by the way, they're not going to do this just because they feel like it. They have a reason for it. The reason why is they're responding to encroachment of their lands, again, and violated treaties. I mentioned earlier that the American government will negotiate treaties with independent native tribes, native nations. But settlers are going to violate them. And obviously, if that's going to happen, you're going to have to retaliate in some way. So why not retaliate with violence? So one war that will break out is going to be the first of the many Indian wars throughout U.S. history, but this isn't a relatively important one. It's going to be the Northeast Indian War in 1794, which is again during Washington's tenure. We're going to get a series of battles between the actual American military and a series of Native American tribes united against the Americans and American settlers. A few important battles would be Battle of Fallen Timbers and Tippecanoe, which is, yes, a battle that's mentioned in one of the political campaigns. Not sure why it's relevant to whoever that candidate was. But do know that Native Americans will be pretty hostile to westward expansion, which is tension. Another point of tension is actually going to build between the British and the Americans, because the British are going to support the Native Americans in spite of the Americans. And that kind of support will translate into a future war that we will be in, which is the War of 1812. And it will involve quite a bit of Native American leaders that will, again, be leaders of Northeast Indian War, or will be related to conflicts in the Northeast Indian War. Probably the most notable will be Tecumseh, who will die in the War of 1812, but that's not important. Okay, the last key point is, with westward expansion comes expansion of slavery. The North, as I mentioned before, will develop an abolitionist sentiment, while the South will develop a pro-slavery sentiment. The South wants to keep their economy going. The North views it as a moral skill issue on part of the Southerners, because it is a moral skill issue. Anyways, so I did mention that from New England and the Middle Colonies, in that general area, we're going to move westward into the Northwest Territory, aka the Ohio River Valley and all that Midwest stuff. In the South, we're also going to move west as well. And what Southerners are going to do is they're going to bring slaves with them. The reason why this is actually quite important is that the expansion of slavery is going to not be overlooked this time. And there's going to be a distinct divide between the North and South over this entire thing. Remember, the Northwest Territory, which is the territory west of New England, or the North, is anti-slavery. They prohibit slavery. But in the area west of the South is going to be pro-slavery, because it's pro-slavery people moving over down there in the West. And so all you need to know is that the expansion of slavery will build up tension between regions, specifically the North and South. So this is a little prelude to what would be the Civil War. Obviously, it's not the direct thing, because we have a whole antebellum period to discuss. But that's about it. Are there any questions about this? This is also a very short topic. I'm seeing no questions. So, since there are no questions, we are going to move on to someone's typing, so CET. Not yet. We have to do an SAQ adapted from not adapted actually. This is directly from the APUSH exam. This is actually 2023. If you do the calculations right, you'll see why I laughed at that. So this is an actual SAQ that people did, and I want you guys to attempt it. I'm gonna give you guys 10 minutes tops, and we'll regroup, and we're gonna see if you guys can apply what you know in general about the American Revolution. This will squarely in Unit 3. As always, if there are any questions, feel free to ask me. I'm more than happy to respond. For our friends in the recording, This is just up here so that you guys can see what's going on. Because the text is a little tiny again. Okay. For A, briefly describe one major difference. You can use quotes, but in a time constraint, what I did was paraphrase. And yes, I do attempt these SAQs myself. So, for some reason, some of them do go over my head. But, yes, you can paraphrase. That's acceptable as long as you paraphrase them well. That is, if you explain them well, then it's good enough for me. And also for the graders. We will get to the CED, by the way, after this SAQ. As time permitted. Always am in with the responses. Appreciate the effort you're putting into this. As for everyone else, please try to attempt this SAQ, because this is a real SAQ that College Board wrote. So this is, I mean, the other SAQs are also written by College Board, but they have been either edited or adapted in some way. It's also 3 parts, so beneficial for you guys to work on problems directly from the exam. How are we looking on time? Do we need more time to do this? Yes, more time? Okay. I'll give you guys 2 to 3 more minutes. So that will be 5:12 a little bit. We will have to go through this because there might be a lecture in this channel and I don't want to take up too much time. But obviously take your time if you need it. It is 5:11, so I suggest wrapping up your thoughts quickly, because I won't have enough time to go over the CED and leave up some questions for you guys. Okay. What a response. Yay. While I'm reading this, I'll leave Obsessor to finish their response. So, A. One major difference between the documents is who the American Revolution impacted. Reed believes that the Revolution highlighted an unfair democracy and contradicted slavery, while Breen focused on how the Revolution brought white colonists new roles. Good. He also did A. Gordon Reed says the Revolution led to African Americans only hoping liberty would spread to them, while Breen said it caused actual change. Political change for white colonists would be a good thing to add to that. Both good responses, looking at good things. For part B, one specific evidence that could be used to support Reed's argument in the Northwest is the Northwest Ordinance. Although it did not outlaw slavery in the current states, it forbade slavery in the Northwest Territory, where new populations would be settling. This idea followed the precedent that all American citizens have unalienable rights and that they should be treated equally. Okay. Pretty good point. Another thing you could talk about is the rise of abolitionism, gradual abolition or gradual emancipation in the northern states as well, dictated in some of their constitutions or legislation. But that's a good piece of detail, event or development. Okay, part C. One specific evidence that can be used to... One specific evidence that can be used to support Breen's argument are institutions created in support of liberty, such as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These organizations consisted of common folk and allowed the people to organize boycotts and take direct action against British rule. Hence, these organizations allowed common folk to gain leadership roles in the revolution and support Breen's argument. Not exactly institutions, but organizations. I know I'm being picky with the term, but they are an organization. But you're looking at it in the right direction for this. That's a good point. Let's see. Think of another way we could answer this question. The notion of legislative bodies, actual congresses for states, mini congresses as I like to call them, will also work as well. All right. Well, all this looks good. Committees, yeah, it's a weird word to spell. With that said, let's take a moment to walk through the CED. Hold on. So, stream should be ended. So let's do a walkthrough through the CED, because I think this will benefit students a lot. And someone asked me if I could do that. So I'm going to do just that. So, give me a second. Let me share my screen here. Share this window. Can you guys see my screen with the CED? For those of you who are watching the recording, you can see it because you're looking at my screen. Okay, cool. So what we did is we skipped 3.1 because 3.1 is all about all this stuff that's covered in the actual unit. So we skipped that. 3.2 was about the 7 Years' War. It's about colonial rivalry leading to conflict. That would be the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. The British victory, will lead to territorial gains, but expenses. What they will do for that is they will tax the colonists, and they're going to create resistance among colonists. So that's all you need to know about 3.2, and here's a bunch of optional sources, and I use some of those. 3.3 is called taxation without representation. Basically, it details what the British did that the colonists would resist. Taxes. You know, the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and also other ways that the British tried to assert their own authority. Declaratory Act, weird word, Townshend Acts, and the Quartering Act, which is part of the Coercive Acts. And the idea of the Enlightenment is going to be repeated over and over. That's also in the philosophical, one of the future topics. As for this part here, the third development that I'm going to highlight, this will be quite similar. I connected this to this fourth development. Basically, is how colonists will build kind of support and a patriotic movement or an independence movement among colonists. So far, does any of those developments sound familiar to you guys? You guys feel confident about those topics? There's a lot of optional things, but I think they're rather popular history in some ways. 3.4, philosophical foundations. Bold. Enlightenment. You need to know. Yeah, that's pretty much about it. The Enlightenment, the key ideas of democratic principles. Yeah. It's a pretty short topic. American Revolution, you do not need to know how the military history, but you need to know there was loyalist opposition. You also need to know that European allies were a factor into our victory. You need to also know that an ideological commitment to liberty and all that was a pretty good factor as well. And again, some details that I used for the lecture. 3.6, okay, all this should sound very recent because we just did a lecture, but if I missed anything, please let me know. So, revolutionary ideals, growth of abolitionism, Republican motherhood, the role of women in the American political culture, literally that term right there, teaching Republican values, there it is, and other revolutions throughout the world. Also, future independence movements will also go into modern history as well. It doesn't have to be colonial history. So, for example, the Xinhai Revolution in China will actually partly be inspired by the American Revolution. Fun fact, Sun Yat-sen was inspired by that. But you don't need to know that as well. Move on to the Articles of Confederation, state constitution, strict limits on the national government. There's the Northwest Ordinance. You got to know that explicitly, apparently. And you need to know the struggles with the Articles of Confederation. Constitutional Convention, this is all the debates on what the Constitution should look like, what our national government should look like. Hopefully all this is sounding familiar. Constitution is really short. It's that. That's it. You got 3 branches. You separate the powers for these branches, and then there's a central government that is strong, but it is limited, so that the state governments will also have their own powers. That's federalism. That's it. 3.10 is the heavy one. So before I move on and yap about that, any questions about what any of the previous topics? Any developments? Does this all sound familiar? Maybe not crystal clear, but pretty clear. Took notes on this. Good job. You're locked in. Okay, 3.10. Yeah, it's 2 pages. I don't know why, but they choose to make it long. So let's go through it a little bit more comprehensively. U.S. government forged diplomatic initiatives. So I'm talking about treaties. The Jay Treaty, the Pinckney Treaty. Those are about it. War between France and Britain, aka the Napoleonic Wars, is going to be a challenge regarding free trade and foreign policy. Whether or not they should be involved is a question. Intervening in the French Revolution or supporting which nation was also a question among the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Again, let me reiterate this. Democratic Republicans like Jefferson supported France, and not because they love France. Well, okay, some of them do, like Jefferson. The other side is going to believe in, okay, maybe we shouldn't get involved. So, pretty much pro-British. There's that. The Spanish, supported by bonded labor, expanded missions into California and social mobility among soldiers, and led to new cultural blending. This development has not been tested for a while. I don't think it's going to be tested at all. For me, I don't think is the most important takeaway from this. These two, on the other hand, the first two are pretty likely to appear in the exam. Ambiguous relationship. This one might not be tested a whole lot, but it is a good thing to know because it does establish some kind of context to better understand the relationship between Native Americans and the American government in future units. That is to say, pretty bad. Anyways, you need to know the administrations of Washington and Adams, how they applied the ideas of constitutions. So mainly Washington's the most important. Whiskey Rebellion, putting that down. But also the practicing the necessary and proper clause. Adams kind of violating the First Amendment. But yeah. That's it. For this part, this is just basically the rise of political parties. You know how they rise, for the most part, their stances are. I forgot to mention, that reminded me, Democratic Republicans were more aligned with agrarian voters or agrarian classes, while the Federalists were more wealthy people who were well aligned with the merchant classes. Okay, and George Washington's farewell address encouraged national unity as he cautioned against political factions and warned about the danger of permanent foreign alliances. This part, not exactly the most important thing to know from this topic, but good to know in general. Okay. Any clarification you want with 3.10? Oh, it's topic. That's for sure. Could I go over Hamilton's economic plan? Like in general with the bank, like in general or specifically with the national bank? Like in general. Okay. So the bank will be part of the economic plan. Hopefully you know that. The purpose of the bank, if you will permit me to do so, I will go into more depth. Basically, the whole idea with the bank is to regulate the economy through deposits. Our current Federal Reserve, which is an extension of, which is what represents the national bank in some ways, what it does the same exact thing regarding deposits and reserves. Another key part is tariffs. Now, today tariffs suck for us, but at the time, his idea with the tariff was to protect the American economy, which makes sense because it's a young economy. It's not, well established like it is now. So what it would do, it would tax imported goods. Yeah, it was aimed to really promote manufacturing within the Americas so that you don't have to import too much stuff. So that's the point of the protective tariff. Another key idea is that Congress would assume all debts. This was mainly to help the states more. Maybe not wealthy states like Virginia, but it would certainly help smaller states like New England, within New England. New England is not a state. Do not make that mistake. And yeah, that's pretty much his economic plan. And for the most part, his plan worked very well. You have to give him that, even if you hate his pretentiousness and snobbiness. So. Go Hamilton. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to 3. I don't think 3.11, 3.12 are going to be too important. New forms of national culture developed. How were they expressed? Art, literature, and architecture. Federal architecture. John Trumbull's art. Yeah. And pamphlet. This is a specific pamphlet, which is interesting. But the things I want to talk about, the American Gothic novels, yes, Charles Brockden Brown. But of course, you can also talk at some point about, oh god, I'm blanking on American romantic novelists. I should not be doing this. I studied that. And just skipping Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know. Some of them kind of do fall in line with Unit 4 though. This topic is not entirely too important, but know that it is happening. It's in the background. John Trumbull, here he is. So yeah. And a key detail about John Trumbull, he's also served in the American Revolution as well. Can you guys hear me? I just saw that someone asked a question whether or not I was talking. Okay. Check whether or not you are deafened. If you cannot hear, hold on, let me time this out. If you cannot hear me, this is just going over the CED. The recording will be posted. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Let's finish up. Movement in the early republic. Natives opposed encroachment on their land. There, they want to limit the migration of white settlers towards west. This one is a very vague development, but it seems like a no-brainer. This one, north versus south. That's pretty much it. Okay. Any questions about all of those topics? The entirety of Unit 3. By the way, the last topic is literally just a historical thinking skill. You don't need to go through that. All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to do this in here in the slides. Oh, wait. I don't think you can see that. But yeah, scan the QR code if you can see it for the feedback. That would be much appreciated. Let me copy the link URL. There you go. I would love to have your feedback just to make sure that I am keeping up some certain quality. I do not know the topics. I cannot predict the topics for the DBQ or LEQ or SAQs. You're just gonna have to find a way to keep keep the information in your head. That's the challenging part with APUSH, is that it's a little more content heavy. Yeah, I can't make any predictions, unfortunately. All right. So, since nobody has any questions on the unit, feel free to ask me any questions about the exam, any clarification. The recording will be posted on the lecture calendar, which is linked in Lance's most recent announcement. So I just linked the announcements channel. So if you go there, click on lecture calendar, you will see that I will be posting slides as well as lecture recordings. So yeah, I'm assuming a lot of people who are interested in this session can't make it, and most of them just watch the lecture recording. Okay, anything else regarding APUSH? I'm seeing no one is typing in the chat, so it might be safe to say that there are no questions as of now. Is that a fair statement to make? Yeah? Okay. So in that case, I'm going to leave you guys off. I'm sorry I went over time. But I'm going to quickly end. Actually, I won't. Thank you so much for staying throughout. There will be office hours half an hour later at 6, so if you have any questions, you can go in on there. Aside from that, this is the end of the lecture. Have a good day, if you have much day left. I know for some of you East Coasters, it's like 8:30 down there, so have a good night there in that case.